Hi there, hope you're doing really well. Welcome to this Insomnia Insight episode, which is, I think, is going to be particularly helpful if you have a background in psychology, if you are familiar with, traditional, conditioning and deconditioning, extinction, and those type of things. This will be ideal for you. We're going to look at a letter from a previous client of mine who happens to be a therapist, and I'm going to do my best to kind of like, for those of you who are not so familiar with these concepts, to be kind of as somebody who clarifies and becomes a liaison or whatnot, whatever we want to call it. We're just going to jump into this email right away. Let's just go right into it. There's always nothing here as a medical advice, just me sharing a nice email from a previous client who wanted to really help someone, perhaps like yourself, who has some struggle with sleep at this moment. Let's take a look. And by the way, this letter starts, "Thank you for your wonderful reply." And just to give you a little bit of background there, Jen, I worked with in BedTyme, and as mentioned, she's a therapist, which often can add another layer of pressure because you have this deep understanding of how the mind works, yet you're having trouble sleeping, which comes from a place where you were never really taught anything about sleep and insomnia, so it can be really confusing, right? And now she did really well, and month later had what we call a speed bump, and I just replied at that point that really the only thing I saw happening was some fear of fear, that there was really nothing else going on. It's just like fear of fear, which can happen often. And with that said, let's jump back here. And so that was the quote unquote wonderful reply. And let's continue reading here. So Jen says, "I'm going to ABA bomb you." And by the way, if you're not familiar with ABA, it's applied behavioral analysis. I may say that wrong. If I did, just to Google it. I wanted to share a bit of insight with you that I had sort of shared several months ago through the app, but I'm not sure it ever made a lot of sense. Haha, you said that education is so important for acceptance, and it was so much for me. I want to share what has helped me the last time and this one. I know that you know this stuff already, but it's sort of lined up in my brain again, and I realized that this might be really helpful for other people to know. I had told you that I'm an ABA therapist, and I think of this stuff in those terms, but so does CBT-I and ACT. And by the way, I want to take just a super quick break here before we go back to the email, which is that if you are a therapist, I really think that it can help to look at insomnia like Jen did in a previous conversation, sort of like a phobia, because when you do, things start to line up, because the way you approach, fear of spiders, that can translate very much to a fear of being awake, and that can align things in a way that I think is helpful if you have that background. But anyway, let's go back here. So Jen says, "Recently I had anxiety at night due to high stress unrelated to sleep, but right when I had anxiety, I responded strangely. I responded like I was back in the insomnia days. I immediately took a sleep medication and put a pillow over my head and tried to sleep. I wasn't even worried about sleep. What the?" This is funny now, but at the time it was very confusing. And the next day I started worrying, but I wasn't sure what I was worried about. I wasn't afraid of sleeplessness anymore. What was I afraid of? I guess I was just afraid of having anxiety habitually at night again, and this impacting my function. Anxiety sucks. It doesn't feel good. I didn't want to have that, but why would I anticipate this happening every night? So here's the gist. Okay, so we see why things were confusing, and here comes sort of the insight in the explanation. Through repeated pairing of anxiety, nighttime, and sleeplessness, I used to anticipate insomnia and anxiety at night. CBT-I taught me to sleep with anxiety through sleep restriction and focus on stimulus control so I wouldn't fear my bed, etc. However, the thing about conditioned responses is that they recur like multiple times. It's called spontaneous recovery, and it's super normal. And here we have a figure talking about extinction, and we're seeing here that the dog in this famous Pavlovian experiment, the dog stopped salivating after a while, while Pavlov rang the bell and did not present the food. So sometimes if a stimuli is similar to a stimulus that used to elicit sleeplessness or anxiety, spontaneous recovery can occur. This knowledge alone helped me to understand what happened last time when I had recurrence of anxiety and reacted like I was back in the sleep anxiety days. And the treatment for this is to unpair stimulus from response, but it's tricky to do that. Actually, let's take a quick pause here from the message from Jen and talk about this like spontaneous recovery. And the way I think we can think about it is like, okay, if we think about like the traditional CBT-I approach and stimulus control specifically, the idea is that with the time of, let's say, pairing, anxiety, sleeplessness, and the night, the bed has become a place where you are at night, right? And the bed has become a trigger for anxiety and then sleeplessness. So the idea is that you should unpair this. You should, the bed should no longer be a trigger for being awake and anxious. So therefore, if you have been awake for more than 15 minutes, you should get out of your bed and do something else and only return when you're sleepy again, so as to pair the bed with other experiences or things. So you pair the bed with being asleep and not being anxious. That's kind of one of the ideas of CBT-I. But then Jen points out there's this thing called spontaneous recovery. So even if you've done this, which I think is very, very true, this whole 15-minute rule I think is very, very tricky and slippery. And I personally don't recommend it to anyone because it makes you focus on time and there's so much pressure, etc. But let's say somebody has done this and they found that, yeah, after some time, I now go to bed and I don't automatically become anxious or awake. Well, that can be helpful, of course, but then you have this spontaneous recovery where some other thing, a neighbor telling you that they can't sleep or whatever it is, can sort of like make you spontaneously recover that same conditioning you had before, where the bed again becomes a place where you have trouble sleeping, etc. So that's the way I think of this concept of spontaneous recovery. Hopefully that was clarifying to some degree. Let's continue reading. And Jen says, but it's tricky to do that. I think, because of what I said and what we'll read here going on here. How do you unpair anxiety from insomnia, ? I guess CBT-I is okay at it, but ACT is even better. For those of you not familiar, ACT stands for Acceptance Commitment Therapy, and it is basically the same thing as NATO. The core of it is very similar, I want to say. So ACT, I'm a firm believer in this. CBT-I tricks your brain by unpairing the stimuli with the response. ACT does this by changing the response to the stimuli. Super cool. And ACT does this other cool trick where it extinguishes the response to all the other stimuli associated with sleep, anxiety, insomnia, and not just the stimuli of that CBT-I has targeted, which was in the case of stimulus control, like the bed, right? Which is a very narrow target. Like the goal is for you not to have like anxiety paired with the bed, but what about all the other million things that can make you like worried about sleep, etc. Right? So CBT-I is a very narrow target. ACT has like a kind of global, universal application. So that's a little my comment there again. CBT-I sort of chokeholds insomnia by forcing sleep despite anxiety, so that eventually the two conditions are unpaired, sort of. They are impaired temporarily until the stimuli provokes spontaneous recovery. But ACT teaches a person to make a different response in the face of all the stimuli associated with insomnia and sleep anxiety. So if I would rephrase this in my words, I would say that ACT, Acceptance Commitment Therapy, it's not about like trying to force a different association in your brain, force a different conditioning, force extension, for this and that, control things. It is rather that you change the response. So yeah, this happened. Yeah, I was awake a lot last night. Yes, I was quite anxious. Yes, this is uncomfortable, but I can be okay with that. I can accept that happened. I don't have to try to force a change or fight this. And when that response has changed, then the stimuli, which can be like in Jen's example, like there was some stress at work, that stimuli can still be there. It can still trigger some trouble sleeping at night, but there's no response to it. There's not this kind of trying to force a change, and therefore not much more happens. Things become peaceful again. So that's kind of my way of hopefully expressing what Jen meant to say here. Let's continue reading. So, for example, some stimuli are super associated with a bout of insomnia that I had initially. Anxiety at nighttime is one of those things. So in the past, anxiety in the night for Jen automatically meant, oh my gosh, I'm going to have insomnia. It triggered a lot of those thought patterns. Although the fear of insomnia underwent extinction, so Jen was no longer afraid of being awake at night, the conditioned response to anxiety needed to go through another bout of extinction. Spontaneous recovery of a conditioned response occurred, although much lower intensity and for shorter duration. And the extinction process involves just sort of knowing that it's not real, allowing it to be okay, allowing it to be, and reminding myself that, like a reflex, just my brain stuck on a scratch in the record. Understanding this helped me to employ acceptance completely. It also gives me total faith in the process that you teach for insomnia. I wish there was a way to communicate this to everyone. I don't know if that would help anyone else, but it helped me and I wanted to share. So let's take a break here and say, like, to me, what Jen is talking about in kind of like language here is that speed bump again. Spontaneous recovery is sort of like a speed bump that for Jen, the fear of being awake at night through education and acceptance, etc., had faded, but it can spontaneously recover. Or the way I put it is like you can have, I don't know how actually, residual. I often talk about you can have a little residual fear that is kind of reactivated. Same idea. And exactly like Jen says, just knowing that spontaneous recovery or having some residual fear that's reactivated is completely normal and expected. That helps so much when you have this speed bump. And just like Jen says, she had this speed bump, but it was lighter, it was milder, it was shorter than in the past, in my opinion, thanks to understanding and not responding to it, etc. So that is kind of like the way I would phrase that. And I think here Jen kind of she completed in the email, but then had some more ideas. Let's look at this as well, or added some more ideas. So here we see this higher order, second order conditioning figure, where we can see that, for example, an electric can opener is a conditioned stimulus with food, unconditioned stimulus, which equals salivation in a cat. Now, what can then happen is that maybe there's a squeaky cabinet door where presumably where you take out the electric can opener, which then becomes the second order stimulus, and then so that squeaky door kind of makes the cat think of the electric can opener, and now not even without the food present here, there is salivation. And finally, you can finally that the door itself, the squeaky cabinet door in itself, can cause salivation. So now we looked at this higher order conditioning. Let's see what Jen thinks about this. Also, not to be long-winded about this part, but this is also applicable to the process too. Check these out, and I'm sure you know these clients who have experienced those conditions. So you know the phase people go through when they try to solve the problem of insomnia by doing things like changing the sheets, the pajamas, medications, etc. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Experimental neurosis is the word for this. And then when people feel like they've tried everything and they give up, learned helplessness. So we're going to look at these two terms that Jen is presenting here: experimental neurosis and learned helplessness. Let's look at the first one. Experimental neurosis is an abnormal behavioral condition. The subject is typically placed in a problem-solving or discernment scenario that they cannot solve because it's too difficult or impossible. This can result in erratic altered behavior that mimics a mental disorder. Experimental neurosis is essentially a psychosis that is produced artificially. The stress of not being able to solve the experimental problem causes the behavior to appear. When the animal is first learning, so this is kind of an animal setting, when the animal is first learning what the desired behavior is through reinforcement and punishment, it can become confused and stressed. This stress can cause abnormal behavior like aggression or fear of the experimenter, which would not be present during normal circumstances. Pavlov noticed in his experiments with dogs that when the dogs were very confused and unable to distinguish between the stimuli, they would growl and act aggressive toward the experimenters, which was abnormal behavior for the well-trained dog. So the way I think of this, if I would sort of translate experimental neurosis here, is, when you have this idea that you can make yourself sleep, if you just can figure out how, you're trying to do what Jen calls, like, you're trying to do something that is literally impossible. But it's so important to achieve that you keep trying. You try the pajamas, the sheets, the this and that, but it is actually trying to do something that's impossible. And it's so confusing because sometimes, for some random reason, you may not actually be as you may not be trying that hard one night, and then you sleep a little bit more, and then you think, oh, it's because I did this, and then another night nothing happened. Instead, it can be very confusing. And this experimental neurosis, I mean, it's a very kind of powerful language, but it says a lot. You can literally, feel very confused. It can be very tricky when you're trying to achieve something by experimenting. But in reality, what you're trying to achieve is impossible to experimenting. Very confusing. So I think just knowing that this is normal, knowing that the experimental neurosis is normal, when you think you can achieve something that's literally impossible, again, can be so helpful. Everything that makes your experience more, normalizes your experience, I think is so helpful. And finally, learned helplessness is behavior exhibited by a subject after enduring repeated aversive stimuli beyond their control. It was initially thought to be caused from the subject's acceptance of their powerlessness, discontinuing attempts to escape or avoid the aversive stimuli, even when such alternatives are unambiguously presented. Upon exhibiting such behavior, the subject was said to have acquired or learned helplessness. Over the past few decades, neuroscience has provided insight into learned helplessness and shown that the original theory actually had it backwards. The brain's default state is to assume that control is not present, and the presence of helpfulness is what actually is learned first. However, it is unlearned when a subject is faced with prolonged aversive stimulation. This was very interesting to me and sort of aligns with what I believe and teach, which is that the default when it comes to sleep is for the brain to believe that there is no control, or not even consider control. So the baseline state, if you will, is that there is no belief in any type of control. And this can be confusing because it looks like people who sleep well, they have control, but in fact they don't. Nobody has control. And that person who sleeps well also, they in their brain, there is not an idea that they have control. The default state is for the brain to believe that there is no control to be had. And that's all of what I teach here is really about that. It's about learning that there is no control to be had. There is no way to control what is impossible to control. And if you're new to this channel and you hear this, I know it can be really scary to hear this. But it is, I believe, very true. If you have, studied the content here, or you have a little bit more understanding and you spend some more time here, then it can actually be liberating to hear that. When you hear that there is no control to be had, that is the default state of the brain. It can be liberating, because then you see what am I trying to do? Why am I struggling? I can let go of the struggle, and sleep will happen all by itself. So I want to say, before we end this episode, I want to say, I'm sure I got some concepts kind of mixed up here. If you're a therapist and you understand this better than I do, please comment, please share your thoughts, insights. And a big thanks to Jen, of course, who has shared this with us. And I think, again, particularly if you have some background as a therapist, I think this can be super helpful for you. You can probably understand much more than I did. But anyway, thanks so much for this. And as always, if you have comments, please leave them in the comment section. If you are looking for a little bit more guidance and support on your path to sleeping well for the rest of your life, then head over to thesleepcritical.com, of course, and hopefully you'll find an option that is really helpful for you. That said, Thanks for today, and look forward to having you back here real soon.